We're rolling.
Okay, this is an interview at the Days Inn, Nanuet, New York, on September 27th, 2004, approximately 2:30 p.m. Interviewers are Wayne Clark and Mike Russert. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
My name is Peter Sarantapoulas. I was born June 22, 1923 in Johnson City, New York.
Okay. Could you tell me what your educational background was before you entered service?
I went to Binghamton North High School and I graduated when I was 17. And the day of my graduation, I was being sworn into the Navy up at Albany, New York. That was January 27, 1941.
Now, you volunteered.
Volunteered.
Now, at 17, you said you were 17? Your parents signed for you?
Had to sign. Had to get parents' consent.
Okay, where did you go for your basic training?
Well, after I was sworn in Albany, New York, we got on buses. They took us to Newport, Rhode Island. And I spent approximately 3 months up there going through boot camp. After boot camp was
Now, what
over,
was boot camp like there? At that time, this was very early before the war. What was it like?
well, it was quite strict up there. We fired in 1903 Springfield, and we were taken for boat rides. And the battleship North Carolina came up there before the war, and we saw her in the harbor. That was quite impressive. And after I finished boot camp, they asked me what I wanted to do as a trade in the Navy, and I said, I'd like to be a yeoman. A yeoman is like a male secretary, because I could type. In those days, very few men could type. So they said to me, we need radio men worse than we need yeomen, so we're sending you to radio school in San Diego, California. So I went from Binghamton to Newport to California.
Now, was this the first time you were ever really away from home?
Oh yeah, that's
How did you feel?
Well, I had gone to New York and seen the World's Fair a couple of times before I even joined the Navy. So I traveled a little bit, not much, but a little bit. And I was going to radio school. That was 4 months in San Diego, and that's where all the pictures of the movie stars I have over here.
Okay, so you saw all these movie stars at that time.
They brought radio and TV, not TV. TV wasn't going, but radio shows down to San Diego.
If you hold that like this under your chin and point out who you were meeting and talk about them a little bit. So this was all in 1941 then, before the war?
Pearl Harbor.
Yes, okay.
Okay.
Now that is me here on my left.
Oh, okay, your fingers are in the way there.
If you move your fingers out of the way.
Oh. And
Okay,
in the middle,
you're on the left.
in the middle is Glenn Miller. He came down with his band. That was quite an impressive sight. Down here is Bob Hope's picture, and I'm in the group that's taken here.
Okay.
And we were up in Hollywood one time and went to the Gene Autry show at CBS Studios, and had Gene Autry in the car, and that's me standing on the outside. And this is Jerry Colonna over here. And this is Rochester. He used to be part of the Jack Benny show.
Jack Benny show, yes.
Okay. Who's
Who's
that
this down here?
corner?
Down here is Mary Livingston, and I think that was Jack Benny's wife.
Wife, yes, yes.
Okay.
Okay, well, on the other side you had some...
Oh yeah, over here, this actress over here, that's me, and an actress, her name was Alice Faye. She was quite a big movie actress in those days.
Okay.
She was born in New York City, believe it or not. And over here is Phil Harris, that was her husband. He was a band leader. And up here is Priscilla Lane, another very famous actress back there, but people don't remember her too much.
Okay.
And this is Tex Beneke. He played.
Oh, yes.
He played with the Glenn Miller Orchestra.
Where is he?
That's a Tex Beneke.
Whereabouts?
Where the picture was taken?
No, where
is
is
the
this
civilian?
Here, upper left.
Oh, okay. Yep. All right.
That's about
Okay, I
it.
think this is him here,
Yeah.
Okay.
in the
Got it.
civilian. Okay. So you got to meet quite a few people before you...
Before the war started.
Before the war started.
And once I graduated from radio school in San Diego, they sent me up to San Pedro, California to get on board the USS Argonne. This was approximately 3 months before the Pearl Harbor attack.
Now, what kind of ship was the Argonne?
The Argonne was AG-31. It was a repair ship, named after the Battle of the Argonne in World War I. From San Pedro, we sailed directly to Pearl Harbor. It took about a week. Ship didn't move that fast. And we tied up at 1010 dock. Now, the Argonne was a repair ship. It was stayed at the dock, and small ships and boats would come alongside, and the machinist mates and the crew would work on those boats. Now, I was a radio man. I was not involved with machine work. My job was to work in the radio shack, 4 on, 8 hours off, whatever they called for it. And we were there 3 months before the attack. On the morning of December 7th, I was supposed to go ashore on Liberty. And I've already been on Liberty before. And we usually take the bus from Pearl Harbor to Honolulu, take another bus, we go to Waikiki Beach. That's where all the girls were. I was only 18 at the time, and not married. And I had gotten up, taken my shower, and went down and ate breakfast. My Liberty began at 0900, 9 o'clock. And this was about 7:30. So I went up into the radio shack, and I was fairly new. I didn't know everybody very well in those days. And we were hanging around discussing. Big radio shack. We had a flag on that ship, Com-Base Force. We had a rear admiral in charge. So while I was in the radio shack, it was getting up close to 8 o'clock, we heard boom. Nobody got excited. Pearl Harbor's a noisy place anyway. Boom, another explosion. Boom, another explosion. Now I'm in the radio shack. We don't know what's going on. Finally, supervisor went over and opened the hatch, and we looked over at Battleship Row, and the Arizona was belching heavy black.
Could you show us on this where you were located compared to Battleship Row?
My ship was tied right over here, USS Argonne, and this is Battleship Row right here.
Okay.
So you were only a couple hundred yards, if that, away from...
Well, a little more than that, maybe 300-400 yards.
Okay.
Because it was clear water. We had a clear view to the Arizona. And then we saw it was blowing up, starting to blow up. Then I took a turn, looked to the left, and a Battleship Oklahoma, which was in this row down here, was starting to roll over. Finally, we looked up, and the sky was full of planes, high-flying bombers, and both strafing planes and torpedo planes that hit the battleship. Finally, we saw the rising sun on the planes. Somebody pointed up, said, Japanese. So we tried to get our guns going. What happened on that day, most of the crew members were either ashore or in church. I was not involved as a gunner, being a radio man. So we got the ammunition going and got as many guns as we got. We had some anti-aircraft guns on that ship and one 5-inch gun on a fantail. And I wound up handling ammunition. I was supposed to be in a radio shack, but by then they didn't need me up there. So they bombed us for 2 hours. Now my ship got strafed, but we never got bombed. I hit by a bomb, which was very fortunate.
Was anybody injured or killed on your ship?
No, not during the attack. Not during the Pearl Harbor attack.
Now tell, you had a story about how you laid down on the deck.
Yeah. Well, during the attack, they came strafing over the Argonne, and I hit the deck, and I was laying this way, and the strafer was coming this way. I should have been this way, make it a smaller target. Fortunately, he missed me, but I think he looked down and saw me down there. He wasn't that high, very low. And one battleship got underway, the USS Nevada, the only battleship that got underway. And she came right by the Argonne. And I saw it. And when the Japanese saw her heading seaward, they immediately pounced on her, several planes. They torpedoed, strafing, whatever. And she started to sink. And they ran it aground at the mouth of Pearl Harbor going seaward. She was blocking the way out, So they backed her up and backed her on another spot on the beach, and she was still sitting there when I left the following March. I stayed at Pearl Harbor for 3 months after the attack. I had nothing to do with the clearing up. I was a radio man. I stood in the
Now,
radio.
could you describe this famous photograph before
Yeah.
you?
All right. Now this is a pictures of Pearl Harbor, the whole harbor, Jack. Now this is the Arizona burning and blowing up. My ship was up over here under the crane. That helped save us. That Japanese had to watch out for that crane. He defended my ship a little bit. This is all of Pearl Harbor. Now these two pictures, this is 2 pages, 1, 2, taken from Life magazine. After Pearl Harbor was bombed, no publication could paint or show any pictures of the Pearl Harbor attack. They didn't want the Japanese to know what they had accomplished. That's that.
So you were there for several months afterwards.
3 months after Pearl Harbor, they finally sent me back to the States for assignment to a new ship, USS George Clymer. They sent me to New York and Norfolk, but that wasn't being built. It was being built in Pascagoula, Mississippi. So from New York, I went down to Pascagoula, Mississippi, and got on board the USS Clymer, APA-27. It was an attack transport jet. We sailed all alone. Now the war is on, 1942, through the Gulf of Mexico, and we tied up one night in Key West, Florida. From there we went up to Charleston, South Carolina, and spent several weeks there because they were doing some work on the Clymer. Still more work to be done on it. From there we went up to Norfolk, Virginia, and while we were up there we made a practice landing with the U.S. Army on Virginia Beach. We finally loaded up several ships, and they came out of different ports, New York, wherever, Norfolk, and we headed across the Atlantic, and on November 8, 1942, 11 months after Pearl Harbor, I was in the invasion of North Africa. I had to go ashore on the 4th wave as part of a 5-man radio team to set up a radio station to communicate with our ship. And I spent 10 days on the beach. I did keep some notes on that. And
Now, did you wear Navy gear, or did you have Army equipment on?
well, we
when you were
had
offshore?
all Navy gear, but you wouldn't know that I was a Navy man. I had a steel helmet on, round coveralls, and with an Army patch on my shoulder. That was so the French and the Germans, who at that time were in charge of North Africa, didn't know they were shooting at sailors or Army people. We didn't want to stand out by wearing Navy uniform. We were dressed exactly like the Army. I spent 10 days on the beach. We landed at Port Leote, which is 60 miles south of Casablanca.
Now, did you have any kind of resistance?
Oh yeah, they were shooting at us, yes.
Uh-huh.
Well, we went into Casablanca Harbor, and we couldn't go on board ship at night on top sides because there were snipers in the yard. French and German. At that time, the Vichy French were controlling North Africa, French Morocco. Well, we finally left Casablanca, and we headed back to the States.
Now, what was the job of your radio team?
What?
What did your radio team do for
Well,
those
we had
10
to set
days?
up a radio station on the beach. You could do it with a cell phone today. But we had to set up an antenna and put radio wires into the sand line. We were on them. We never left. We hit the beach. We stayed there. We had a generator and we had a bug, a key. In those days you couldn't talk. You had to use a key. And we communicated with our ship and let the captain know what we were doing and so on. He relayed it on to other ships or admirals or whatever the case might be. I came back to the States and I wound up getting on a Hunter Liggett, and we went through the Panama Canal, Christmas Day 1942, and we finally made the invasion of Bougainville, which is part of the Solomon Islands. After that, I wound up back on the USS George Clymer, and we made the invasion of Guam. I participated in that. Later on, I got onto a communication ship, I came back to the States and got on the USS Panamint, San Francisco. And we invaded Okinawa. I was in the first battle, which was Pearl Harbor, and I was in the last battle, which was Okinawa.
Now, did you have any encounters with the Japanese or
Yes.
kamikazes?
Oh yeah, we carried Japanese prisoners of war 2 different times. The first bunch we took off of Guam and took them down to New Zealand. Just a handful of them, 10, 15. And then the second time we took a bunch of one of the other islands and took them back to Pearl Harbor. Saipan, we picked them off Saipan and took them back to Pearl Harbor. And after we invaded Okinawa, which was the main invasion near Japan, we invaded 3 little islands off Okinawa. And I participated in one, Shima, and that is where Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent, was killed. And he was buried in Okinawa for a while, and they later brought him back to the cemetery in the Hawaiian Islands. That's where he is now. Well, after Okinawa, at Okinawa, believe it or not, I got a rush to go back to electronics school in Dearborn, Michigan. The battle's still on, the war is still on. So I flew from Okinawa to Guam in a 2-engine job as a passenger. I was on my way back to the States. I was a lucky guy, the war was still on. And then from Guam, I flew to Hawaii on a 4-engine job. We island hopped our way back. In those days, we didn't have jets, they were fuel operated. Then from Hawaii, I took a ship back to San Francisco, trained back across the country, and wound up at Dearborn, Michigan, which is outside of Detroit. And the Navy had a school there on Ford's property, electronics school, advanced electronics. And by then, I was a radio man first. I had my 3 stripes. There was only one more enlisted rank I could go up to, and that was Chief Petty Officer. And while I was in school, President Truman dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima. We were all going around saying, "What's the atomic bomb all about?" You know, we didn't know. And 3 days later, they dropped the second one on Nagasaki. And after that, the Japanese agreed to unconditional surrender. Prior to that, they would have surrendered, but they wanted conditional terms. The United States said, "No soap, we want unconditional surrender," and that's why it took so long.
How did you feel about the atomic bombs being dropped on Japan?
At the time, I was very, very happy. Being in the service for the whole war, I saw my way out. And I remember President Truman going on the radio. In those days, we didn't have television around. And said, "The Japanese have agreed to unconditional surrender," which meant the war, shooting was over. The war was not officially over, but the shooting was over. After President Truman spoke, the commanding officer said, "All hands fall out in the parade grounds." And we all fell out with our hands behind our back at attention. And the commander spoke to us and said, "As you've all heard, President Truman has just announced that Japan has surrendered unconditionally." And he made a little speech, and his last words were, "Liberty begins in 15 minutes." Now, we were about 10 miles from downtown Detroit. We ran into the barracks with our dress uniforms on, and people were coming by and picking us up and took us downtown Detroit. That was like Times Square, only it was in Detroit. And we had quite a night that night, as you could be aware of.
And I imagine you couldn't spend any money. Everybody was buying you drinks.
You couldn't spend any money, is right. Everybody's picking you up, taking you any place you want to go. And then I didn't quite finish the school. I was in the process of going to school, and they asked me if I wanted to stay in. And if I had to stay in the Navy, finish that school, which was a 10-month course, I would have to stay another 2 years after that. So I said, no, I want to get out. So they sent me back to New York. I wound up at Lido Beach, Long Island, which is a deep processing center for the Navy. And I got my discharge there. 1945. The war ended. They signed the peace treaty on the Missouri on September the 2nd in Tokyo Harbor, which I was not there, of course. And I was discharged that same month, September the 29th. And that's a picture of me. That's a picture of me when I got out with my medals and 22 years old. Now I went back to Binghamton. You want me to continue?
Sure, just,
Went back to Binghamton, New York, where I came from. I didn't have a job, but me and another ex-Navy radio man, we heard it was a brand new radio station going on in the air. And we went over and told them we were Navy radio men. And they hired both of us.
so you never used the 5220 club?
Oh yes, I
You
did
did?
use it for a while, up until he got the job. Once you got the job, it stopped.
Yeah.
5220, I did use that. It's very handy. Beer money. Had nothing to do with Liberty. So after working there 9 years, I got a job with NBC New York, 30 Rockefeller Plaza. And I worked there for 2.5 years. John Cameron Swayze and Dave Garroway and some of those people were there. And after 2.5 years, I got laid off and I went over and got a job with ABC, same union. And I retired from ABC after 25 years. And that's...
Did you ever use the bill of
GI Bill.
Bill?
I did for, when I was in Binghamton, they had a GI Bill training for a short while, yes, partly yes. In the beginning, when I first went to work at the radio station, but not very long.
Did you ever join any veterans organizations?
I belong to the American Legion right now, post 1682 in New City, New York. I don't belong to the VFW. And I also belong to the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, made up of Pearl Harbor survivors, all services. And I'm president of the local New York Chapter 4, and we meet on the USS Intrepid in New York City. We have a meeting coming up.
I noticed your license plate.
My license plate says Pearl Harbor Survivor, New York State, and number 7. And I got number 7 not because of Mickey Mantle. A lot of people associate with Mickey Mantle. But I was working at WABC Radio 770, Channel 7 television, TV, and it ties in with December 7, 1941. So it worked out very good. I still have that plate. I've had it over 20 years.
That's terrific.
Yep.
Now, did you ever stay in contact with anyone that was in service with you?
Oh yeah, I mean, most of them, unfortunately, as of this late date, are passing away right and left. But I did meet Pearl Harbor survivors. I've gone to ship reunions. Oh yes.
Now, how about telling us you brought this in?
Oh yeah.
Hold it up and
yes.
Wayne can focus on that.
While I was at ABC, the movie Tora 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 came into New York. They were showing the world premiere down there. And I was invited to go. And I heard that they were going to interview Japanese on Channel 7. So I picked up the phone. Now, I'm an engineer with ABC at the time. And I called the producer, that Joe, and I said, if you're going to have Japanese on there, I can get you some Pearl Harbor survivors. I knew a few of them around New York. He says, well, why don't you come over? My throat dropped. I said, okay. And I wound up on a TV show with Minoru Agenda, who was in New York for the premiere of Tora Tora Tora. He's considered the man who planned the Pearl Harbor attack before the bombing even took place. And I wound up on a television show. That's him over here, me in the middle, and the announcer on the right. John Bartholomew Tucker was his name. He worked at ABC at the time. And here's a photograph of a black and white. And I went up and saw the movie. opening night in New York City. In the audience was Minoru Agenda. Fuchida, the commander who led the planes into Pearl Harbor, was there.
Wow.
Now, if I'd have killed either one of them in World War II, I would have got the Congressional Medal of Honor. If I'd have shot them that night, they'd arrested me for murder.
What did you think of that movie?
Well, I thought, many years later, they made an American version of it, and I think that Tora Tora was a much better picture of the whole thing. Whether you liked it or not, it was a better picture. More accurate. It was more accurate.
How did you feel meeting this gentleman?
Well, the announcer says, he's sitting next to me. He says, how do you feel about the Japanese? And I says, well, I don't know. I've never bought a Japanese car, but I bought a couple, 3 German cars. Never bought a Japanese car.
You probably have a Japanese television set though.
Well, you know, when I worked at NBC, everything was made by RCA. RCA owned everything, the microphones, the cameras. Now you walk in down there, see Sony speakers, Panasonic. It's all Japanese equipment now. In fact, RCA would send the parts over to Japan and they would assemble the TV set. They could do it cheaper that way than if they did it here, which I didn't like.
How do you think your time in the service changed or had an effect on your life?
It had a very effective life, dramatic change. My father, believe it or not, worked for Endicott Johnson Shoes. He worked there for 42 years. Well, one day he said to me after I got out of the Navy, I didn't have a job, he says, why don't you go down to EJ and see if you can get a job, Endicott Johnson? I says, Pop, I wouldn't work for EJ if I was starving to death. I didn't want to wind up in the shoe factories. So I wound up in the broadcasting business, so I did gain something out of it.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your interview.
Okay.
All right.